get your Bibles and you can go ahead and open it up to Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9 will be the majority of our text this morning. Today is class 15 of our study through the Epistle to the Hebrews, and we're going to be continuing in that portion of the book which we have kind of informally titled the Heart of Hebrews. This section started back at the beginning of chapter 8 and it's going to run nearly to the end of chapter 10, and it gives the most emphatic explanation of what Christ is currently doing as the Christian high priest, as well as the benefits that we receive by his priestly ministry. Now, we portrayed this long section as being a symphony that is broken up into three smaller movements, each of which repeat some similar motifs, but have their own emphasis and some of their own vocabulary as well. In today's class, we're going to start into the last and the longest of these three movements, which was titled in the syllabus as the New Explained. Our focus today is primarily going to be on the rituals of the old and the rituals of the new, contrasted with one another. Before we get into that last movement, though, let's quickly review some of the material from last week's class that'll help set us up to understand the new movement. Last week, we studied the first 22 verses of Hebrews chapter 9. This was the second movement of the symphony in which the author discussed those three themes that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks now: sanctuary, sacrifice, and then covenant. He discussed these three themes with the particular emphasis of foreshadowing. The primary message was pretty simple. The insufficiencies of the old sanctuary, the old sacrifice, and the old covenant foreshadow the necessity of the new. So, at the start of chapter 9, in the first 10 verses, the author demonstrated the insufficiencies of the old tabernacle, that one that was built by the ancient Israelites under the supervision of Moses. In those verses, we saw a description of what the tabernacle looked like, or at least of how it was architecturally designed. It was broken apart into two rooms, a holy place and a most holy place, that had different levels of furnishings. One room had more plain furnishings, while the other had much more gold furnishings. And this tiered approach of a holy place to most holy place kind of revealed the relationship between geographic space and holiness. We used a particular word to describe this relationship. Does anyone remember how we described it? No, not sanctuary. We described it as progression. The old sanctuary taught the lesson of progression. As one progressed through space, they also progressed into deeper holiness and deeper nearness to God's presence. That was the first important foreshadowing of the old tabernacle. It showed that one could actually progress towards God's sanctity and towards God's presence. But that wasn't the only message that we learned from looking at the structure of the old tabernacle. What else did the author bring up as being a defining feature of that old tabernacle's architecture?
Separation.
There were these divisions, these barriers that were part of the sanctuary. Sometimes they were called walls or curtains or veils, but whatever we call them, they all teach the lesson that the people's holiness and God's holiness aren't exactly in complete unity with one another. Like Chase said, there is a separation. There's a separation between God and his people. This showed that God's wish of dwelling among his people was not fulfilled in that old sanctuary. You could look at it and you could see divisions still existed. God was not entirely with his people. And because of that, because of those barriers, most people never even drew close to God's presence or close to God's holiness. We saw that while priestly classes could go into the holy place, only the high priest could go into the most holy place, and him only once a year. At best, the old sanctuary and its relationship with the people as a whole, all it did was cleanse the food, the drink, and the bodies of the worshipers. It failed to perfect the human conscience. This perfection of the conscience would not be accomplished under that old system, but instead required what was titled the time of Reformation. Verses 11 through 14 of Hebrews chapter 9 covered Christ's time of Reformation, when he made an offering of his own blood. Verse 14 and really into 15 in particular really emphasize the cleansing of Christ's blood that was never accessible under the old sacrifices. So let's read starting there in 9:14 again, just to kind of refresh ourselves on the potency of Christ's sacrifice. So Hebrews chapter 9, verse 14. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. Christ's blood purifies the conscience, and this also transitions us into the author's discussion of the new covenant. Christ's blood also seals and inaugurates the new covenant. Now, what Old Testament events foreshadowed the inauguration of the new covenant? The author refers to some specifically that he said were signs of the covenant that was to come. Sorry? Not in Jeremiah 31. So back in chapter 8, Jeremiah prophesies about the new covenant, but there were actually foreshadows of the new covenant as well. So he brings up the death and the blood that we see in the old covenants, specifically Exodus 24, when God cut a covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. We referred as well to Genesis 15, where God cuts a covenant with Abraham. That's right. So the cutting of the old covenants, especially the ritual death of the participants that we see in all of these old covenants, was a sign. It was a shadow of the greater, truer covenant that was to come. The author's final point with this is that these old covenants, in fact, all of these covenants, don't just follow a random design. They were intentionally structured by God to point towards the later and greater covenant that is sealed with the Son's blood. Now, in verse 23 of chapter 9, where we will begin today, the author starts all over again and begins the last and the greatest of his movements in this three-part symphony. This last movement is kind of his final flourish in explaining the priesthood of Christ. So I'm not going to say that the rest of our study of Hebrews after chapter 9 and 10 doesn't mention the priesthood of Christ, or that it is theologically simple after this point. But please understand that we're about to transition after this final flourish into a period of extended application. And it probably helps if we remember that this was written as a sermon. So although it doesn't quite follow exactly how we do sermons today, ending with an invitation or some kind of call to repentance, instead the author does still build up his big logical foundation, his theological foundation, before spinning off into an extended period of application, telling people how they can live with Christ as their high priest. Before we get to that extended application, though, we have to make it through this last movement. Now, since this one is the longest, I have broken it up into two classes. That means in today's class, we're not going to go through sanctuary, sacrifice, and covenant. We're going to get through sanctuary and hopefully about half of sacrifice. And then we're going to have to pause where we can pick up in next week's class, discuss the rest about Christ's sacrifice before moving into those final remarks concerning Christ's new covenant. So let's get started now this morning into our new material. Let's begin by reading together Hebrews chapter 9, verses 23 and 24. The cleansing of the sanctuary. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. We kind of pick up this last movement, it feels like, in the middle of the author's train of thought. When he refers to the copies of heavenly things, what is he talking about? The earthly tabernacle, that's right, the one that was constructed by Moses, and they had to be purified with these rites. What rites is he talking about? That's right, specifically those Old Testament sacrifices of purification. The author's immediate purpose in bringing up the old tabernacle and the old sacrifices is to make a simple argument from lesser to greater. If earthly copies, the earthly sanctuary, required such elaborate ritual purification, then what's required for the superior heavenly sanctuary? That's right, a superior heavenly offering. We've seen this pop up a few times already, but we should not be deceived into thinking that the new sacrifice or the new covenant is somehow less intense than the old. It's somehow less purifying or somehow less ritualistic. We see that it is superior in every way. We need a superior, better offering and better cleansing for the heavenly things. That is the simple purpose of these verses. But before we move on, since this is the last time that we're really going to investigate the sanctuary aspect, I'd like us to pause and consider a few questions that should pop up when we read these verses. Now, in verse 23, I've checked the primary modern English Bible translations, and it appears that every one of them uses the word necessary to describe the relationship of the sanctuary to its rites of purification. That word seems appropriate, as it fits the context of the section that came just before. In Hebrews 9:15 through 22, we just read about how there was a necessity of death in order to establish a covenant. Then we saw there was a necessity to shed blood in order to forgive sins. And now we see that there is a necessity for purification to have a sanctuary. What I want to ask is why? And I'm not asking why ritual offerings are part of this purification process, but why a purification process was even necessary to begin with. We should remember that the copies of the heavenly things in verse 23 is talking about a building. It's talking about an earthly structure, an earthly sanctuary that was built by the Exodus generation. This is referring to a real building and its furnishings. Why would a physical structure require ritual cleansing? And to answer this, we're going to have to perhaps go outside of our typical Western thinking about buildings and attempt to broaden our worldview a bit to adopt some biblical imagery. So I'm going to do some presuming here about the audience and say that most of us probably don't judge most of the buildings that we interact with according to their moral cleanliness. That perhaps just doesn't even cross our mind. Buildings aren't good or evil. They haven't done anything. They're just a structure. They're just a structure that maybe actions happen inside, but we don't think of themselves as having any kind of moral identity. To us, the idea of ritually purifying a building, especially by splashing it with herb water and then blood, sounds very archaic, perhaps even very pagan. We know that a building doesn't have moral qualities, so why would a building require moral cleansing? The biblical reason why a building would require moral purification lies in allegory. What if a building isn't just a building? What if it represents something more than simply the sum of its parts? What if a building represents something else that does have moral capacity? Something like a group of people. And this might sound like we're stretching things a bit, like we're using our imagination too much, but this allegory of buildings representing groups of people shows up all over Scripture. I think the most clearly stated place where we see this allegory appear is going to be back in Leviticus 16, when God first gives the purification rites for the old tabernacle. Let's turn back to Leviticus 16 now, and let's take a look at that event and the commands that God gave for the old sanctuary. Now, we've already referenced and read Leviticus 16 several times through the book of Hebrews. This is where God speaks through Moses to give the instructions concerning the Day of Atonement. So he is talking to Moses, who then goes and talks to Aaron and his sons, telling them how they are supposed to conduct themselves and all the rituals on this holy day. Now, while we have brought up the rarity of the Day of Atonement, we haven't talked too much about what the high priest does on that day, what he does within the tabernacle, and especially within the most holy place. So in Leviticus 16, starting in verse 15, we get to see what the high priest does on this day. Then he, meaning Aaron the high priest, shall kill the goat of the sin offering that is for the people, bring its blood inside the veil, and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it over the mercy seat and in front of the mercy seat. Thus he shall make atonement for the holy place, because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel and because of their transgressions, all their sins. And so he shall do for the tent of meeting, which dwells with them in the midst of their uncleanness. No one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement in the holy place until he comes out and has made atonement for himself and for his house and for all the assembly of Israel. Then he shall go out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it. He shall take some of the blood of the bull and some of the blood of the goat and put it on the horns of the altar all around. And he shall sprinkle some of the blood on it with his fingers 7 times and cleanse it and consecrate it from the uncleanness of the people of Israel. So, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest enters the tabernacle by himself. He even goes all the way into the most holy place, which tends to be called holy place within this text in Leviticus 16. And he makes atonement for several different objects. What things is the high priest making atonement for in this passage? You can list some of those off for me. Okay, so we see that he makes atonement for himself in verse 17. Who else? Sorry?
Israelites.
Okay, so we have all the assembly of Israel, and then also his house, meaning the other priests as well. Okay, so there's the people that he makes atonement for. What else does he make atonement for in this passage? Okay, so we see the altar that shows up in verses 18 and 19. This is probably the altar of incense because it's the one before the Lord there inside the tabernacle. Okay, so I missed that. What was it? So there's the holy place, which implies probably the innermost sanctuary here. What else inside the holy place? It gets a bit more specific. On the mercy seat itself and before the mercy seat, and then he does the room around it. In verse 17, he then leaves the most holy place and gets the rest of the tent of meeting as well. And then we see he gives that particular attention to the altar. The point I want to make from this is that by and large, it is the structure and the furniture within the structure that receive the majority of the atonement. They are the primary focus of the ritual cleansing of the Day of Atonement. In this passage, the people show up very briefly, only at the end of verse 17. God instead explicitly states that the structure requires moral purification. And why does God say that the structure must be cleansed? This is brought up a couple times as well in this passage. He gives the reason. because the uncleanness of the people, their own defilement, and all their sins. That's why verse 17 can mention the atonement of Aaron, his family, and Israel as happening at the same time as the atonement of the tabernacle. The ritual cleansing of the sanctuary and the ritual cleansing of the people happen at the same instant. They happen in the same ceremony. And in fact, we can even press this sameness further. We might say that the sanctuary and the people are cleansed at the same time because they are, in some way, the same thing. The sanctuary is the people. The end of verse 16, I think, states this nicely. The earthly sanctuary not only shares a geographic presence with the people, it's in their midst, just like their neighbors, but it also shares their moral status. So an unclean people results in an unclean sanctuary, and if you cleanse the sanctuary, you are, by effect, cleansing the people. So now we could turn back to Hebrews chapter 9 now, and we'll see how the author uses this idea of the equivalency of sanctuary and people in verse 23. Hebrews 9:23, the author says it's necessary for the old structure, the old sanctuary, to be purified. We just read it was necessary because the sanctuary represents the people. The uncleanness of the people mandates the washing of the sanctuary. Now, this should remind us of perhaps a few different things. Some are going to be from outside of Hebrews, and we'll get to that briefly. But I want you also to remember what we've talked about in chapters 7 and 8 of Hebrews. When we studied those chapters, we introduced this concept that we titled a priestly bundle. And you have this package, this metaphorical package, that contains all these little characteristics and facets of a priesthood that are intrinsically connected to one another. I use the phrase over and over that they rise and fall together. So a superior priesthood necessarily has a superior sanctuary, sacrifice, and covenant. Part of that priestly bundle that we emphasize so much when we kept adding things to it wasn't just sanctuary, but it was also the people who worship at the sanctuary, who participate in the sacrifices, and who are part of the covenant. What we're going to start seeing here near the end of chapter 9 and into chapter 10 as well is something like a collapsing of the priestly bundle. Compression might be a better word, whereas up to now we have been adding all of these separate features of the priesthood and just talking about them as being connected to one another. Now we're starting to actually shove them into one another. We're starting to actually combine these features to view them as a single entity. The equating of the sanctuary with people is a good example of what we're going to see a few times in the upcoming chapter. We shouldn't think of the holiness of the people as distinct and separate from the holiness of the sanctuary. These two share their purity. They share their cleansing. So I think that adequately explains the first half of verse 23. So now we need to talk about the more important half of that verse. If it was necessary for the earthly sanctuary to be ritually purified, then the author says it is also necessary for the heavenly sanctuary to be even more thoroughly cleansed. And this should lead us to ask a couple more questions, like, what is the heavenly sanctuary? And why does it require cleansing as well? Now, we've seen the heavenly sanctuary pop up a lot through this section of Hebrews already. And we've never stopped to discuss exactly what it is. When I've heard classes on Hebrews in the past, I've typically heard it described in very vague ways, perhaps so vague that might even leave people questioning whether or not it really exists. So let me tell you and set this straight. The heavenly sanctuary in Hebrews is not some hypothetical place used for comparison's sake. It's not an analogy. It's not a rhetorical device used to just dreamily talk about where Christ would serve as a high priest. It is very real. And we've already learned a lot about it in Hebrews so far. In this passage this morning, as well as a couple other places, we've seen repeatedly it's not made with human hands, like that earthly old sanctuary was. Who built the new heavenly sanctuary? That's right. It is a product of God's own power, his own constructive force. And as part of that power, we see that God sits in his heavenly sanctuary. He is enthroned there. He rules from there. And this sanctuary is so real that Moses saw it. In some way, Moses saw this heavenly sanctuary, received the pattern or the blueprint of it, and then built a physical copy. So what is it? Does God have some kind of floating temple structure that's going around in the sky, and that's where Jesus serves as our high priest? And of course, the answer is no. It's something more real than that. We can learn more about this super real heavenly sanctuary by going outside of Hebrews, because the author isn't the only one who talks about it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul writes, "Do you not know that you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple." Peter riffs on this same theme in his first epistle, where he writes, "As you come to him," meaning Christ, "a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house." These New Testament authors are agreeing with what we just read in Leviticus 16. The sanctuary of God is the same as the people of God. So God's heavenly sanctuary, the one built with living stones, not by men, but by his own power, is his church. We are his heavenly dwelling place. That is why it is necessary for even the heavenly things to be purified, because we're the ones who need cleansing. We're the ones who required purification, and we are the ones who have become God's dwelling place. And this finally gets us back now to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24. Jesus has walked into the heavenly dwelling place. Jesus has walked into his church, built of living stones, and he has splashed his purifying blood on us. And that means there's no longer any barriers between God's people and God's presence. Now we are the very structure in which God chooses to dwell. And this should remind us from somewhere else in Scripture as well. We're running out of time, but please go ahead and turn over to Revelation 21, where we see that John gives us some very similar imagery to what we're piecing together from all these other New Testament authors. In Revelation 21, John is near the end of his extended vision when he has this vision of the new dwelling place of God. So starting in verse 2 of Revelation 21, John writes, "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God.'" John describes God's final dwelling place as a city. And a city is not a collection of buildings. A city is a collection of people. These people are the church. It is Christ's bride. Later on in verse 22, John writes that in this city there is no temple. Instead, God simply dwells amongst his people. And additionally, in verse 27, John states that this dwelling place is perfectly pure. He writes, "But nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. This is the message that the author of Hebrews is also trying to convey. There is no doubt concerning our purity. We have been washed in the blood of the Lamb. We have been cleansed by his offering. And this finally leads us into the next portion of our text this morning, where we can talk about that offering. We can talk about that blood sacrifice that cleanses us to be God's dwelling place. We're very quickly running out of time, so let's press on now. Back in Hebrews chapter 9, let's start reading together in verse 25. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 25. The author writes, "Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly," talking about Christ entering the heavenly sanctuary, "as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own. For then Christ would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." These opening two verses of the segment on sacrifice set up the contrast that the author wants to emphasize. The members of the old priesthood, they had to make sacrifices every single year. They had to offer blood that was not their own for atonement on an annual basis. We just read about that annual offering in Leviticus 16. Unlike those priests, Christ offers himself only once. Now, the singular nature of Christ's offering might seem simple to us. I'm going to chalk that up to cultural differences between us and the original audience. We live in a society that is very saturated with Christian theology, even if we don't recognize it. And to the original audience and most of the world at that time, sacrifices were expected to be a regular occurrence. So please understand that the author's claim here that Jesus doesn't need to make repeated offerings is novel. And this is going to require some evidence, some justification to prove that he's right about this bold claim. What does the author present as evidence for Jesus' single offering? In verse 26, what does he say proves Jesus' single offering? Okay, so he has only appeared once. Yes, there's something before that, though, that I'm leaning on more. When he appeared, what did he do? At the start of verse 26, it says, Christ has not suffered repeatedly since the foundation of the world. It is the singular nature of Christ's suffering that is brought up as the evidence of Christ's single offering. Okay, so we're establishing a connection here between suffering and offering. Where have we already talked about suffering and offering in the book of Hebrews? These themes have already been portrayed together earlier. Does anyone remember? Go ahead and turn back to Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2, we've already seen some language that described Jesus' suffering there. Hebrews chapter 2, let's read together in verse 9. The author wrote, "But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering." When the author talks about Jesus' suffering, he is at the same time talking about Jesus' death. All right, suffering means death in the book of Hebrews. Does anyone remember why the author emphasized the physical suffering and the physical death of Jesus back in Hebrews chapter 2? You remember the points that we made from that? That he partook entirely in the human experience. It was a message about the incarnation, about how Jesus was fully man, meaning he suffered and died just like us. Jump down in Hebrews 2 to verse 14 with me. We read there, "Since therefore the children," meaning us, "share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil. Therefore in verse 17 now, "Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people." Because Jesus was truly human, he truly suffered and died, and that real human death is the propitiation sacrifice for all of his human brothers and sisters. It is the incarnation. The incarnation of Jesus is what qualifies him to be both our perfect priest and our perfect sacrifice. So let's go back now to Hebrews chapter 9 and look at how the author uses the incarnation in that chapter. Hebrews chapter 9, let's pick up where we left off in verse 27. "And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who eagerly are waiting for him." If Jesus is both the priest and the offering, how does the author say that we know he hasn't offered himself over and over again? What does he say in verse 27? How do we know Jesus hasn't offered himself multiple times? Because men only die once. And because Jesus was truly man, it was appointed for him to only be sacrificed once. It was final at that point. Now, I have often heard verse 27 quoted with no context around it whatsoever as referring to our own death and our own future judgment. And while I do think it is an apt summary of our future, this passage is not primarily written about us. As a man, it was appointed for Christ to die only once. And after that comes the judgment. What does the author mean by judgment here? Was Jesus judged after his death? Was he? He had no sins to be judged for. We know that he was glorified after his death and that he was approved by God, but this isn't referring to any personal judgment of Jesus. What judgment is this verse referring to? Sorry? Man is referring to final judgment. After Jesus' single death, then will come final judgment. Read verse 28 again. It expands on this thought. Christ has appeared on earth once with the express purpose of dying as our sin offering, and when he comes back, it will not be to make another offering for sin, it will be for judgment. That was what Christ's second return will be. And how are we supposed to feel about Christ's future return in this passage? We are eagerly waiting for it. Let's try and make a few quick points of application from this text and see if we have any room to go into chapter 10 at all. First, when Christ returns, we are told it is to save those who eagerly await him, but it is not to deal with sin. If not sin, what is Christ going to save us from during the final judgment? Okay, so maybe the bad part of judgment itself. I would say that's not where the author's going with this, but I do understand where you're going there. I would put that under the category of sin. And so he's already saved us from sin. What are we saved from in the final judgment? Not just the consequences of sin. Well, it is consequences of sin, but I have a very specific one in mind. Death. We just read Hebrews 2:14. That's right. Through death, he destroyed the one who has the power of death. So you are correct. It is a consequence of sin, just a very niche one there. You might remember back when we covered Hebrews 2 that we briefly talked about this idea of now and not yet. about how we see some of the fulfillment of Christ's rule in this earth, but we know that its ultimate fulfillment is coming later. This is another example of that same topic. Has Christ saved you already? Yes, he sure has. He has saved you from sin. Is Christ going to save you in the future? Yes, he will save you ultimately from death. As Christians, we have been saved, we are being saved, and we will be saved. And when Christ returns, it will not be to refresh our salvation from sin. He will return to fulfill our salvation from death. And that is why the message of the finality of Christ's offering is essential and really beautiful. As Christians, we don't move like the Old Testament people through periods of purification and then impurity, and we just hope to get restored to baseline. We go from salvation to salvation, further in. We are constantly being more saved by our priest. Second, let's consider why this would be so relevant to the original audience of Hebrews as well. As we've mentioned in nearly every class, they're going through some kind of persecution. They're going through their own times of trials. And as we'll see once we get to chapter 12, the author expects that his contemporary audience is about to face death. They're about to face threats on their own life if they persevere with God. But this is a group of people who, as we've already seen, they don't know if they can persevere. They don't know if they can stand up to the trials of life or if they are going to fall into the sin of apostasy, denying Christ and falling away. Even if they do persist, it looks like a losing battle because they're not only going to be mocked, it'll likely lead to their bodily destruction. Fortunately, the Christian high priest is stronger than all of these evil forces. By his sacrifice, Christians have been washed and empowered to resist sin, and this washing never requires renewal. And when Christ comes back, even if we have been killed for him, he will restore us, and we will go from victory unto victory. That is why the message of Christ's single offering helps Christians in trial. He said 5 minutes, and that's not what the clock says, but I'm going to take 5 minutes. Let's very quickly then try to start to make our transition into the second portion of Christ's sacrifice. We know that it's final now. He came to only die once. Now let's look at what that final offering accomplished. Hebrews chapter 10, let's read just verse 1 together. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Unlike the single sacrifice of Jesus, the old offerings were repeated every year. In verse 1, what does this reveal about their efficacy? Okay, maybe there's a temporary nature. I think that might be adding a little bit too much into the text. All that it says for us is that they could not make perfect those who draw near. So I wouldn't put forward that it made them perfect for a while. I would say that it failed in the task altogether. The old sacrifices are not capable of setting man free from either sin or death. And this should make us ask one final question. Why did God give them at all? If they weren't something that could purify the conscience, if they weren't something that could perfect the person's morality, if they weren't something that could give forgiveness of sins, why did God give us the old system at all? Okay. What was the purpose God gave it? It's a shadow of better, truer things to come. Now, we've mentioned in previous classes some of the ideas about this contrast or the language that the author uses that we call like Platonic thought, and this one's nearly a direct quote from Plato's Republic. But we've talked about the true form of these realities in class a lot today, so let's end by talking about the shadows of these things. What is a shadow? Does it look like the thing that casts the shadow? It looks very similar, and yet it lacks its substance and it lacks its energy. So why would God provide something that is so lacking? And we have at least two reasons that we know of from Scripture. First, the shadows of the old system teach us how to recognize the realities of the new. By looking at the design, the function, the intention of the old sanctuary and the old sacrifices, we learn a lot about what God intends for his new sanctuary and his new offering. We learn a lot about holiness, about how to worship, how to pray, about the beauty that God expects from us, and about how to be near to the Lord. We also learn how to recognize the true sacrificial lamb, and we learn the benefits that we will receive from him. And this brings us to the second thing we know we learned from the old system. The shadows in the Old Testament show us its own insufficiencies, leading us to desire and expect something better. Paul, in his letters, refers to this idea quite a bit, how the old law reveals sin and its passions, and it teaches humanity about our own impure nature. And the law doesn't reveal all of these insufficiencies so that we get used to them or so that we learn to even like them, but it's so we can look forward to something better. So we can look beyond the old law to the day when human nature will be purified. When the true realities come, then God will truly dwell with his people. We're going to end there. We were supposed to get through verse 4, but that's going to have to wait until next week's class. Where we pick up there, we'll go into a discussion first that kind of enumerates just exactly the insufficiencies of the old sacrificial system was, and then we'll see the complete sufficiencies of Christ's new offering. There are handouts for next week's class already on the tables in the back. Please grab one of those so you can read ahead, and make sure you read the handout for this week too, as we're still going to be covering some of that material once we get to that. Thank you all for your attention.